Welcome to another of our podcasts recorded at the Rockwool Foundation, Berlin, where I am talking to some of the economists who are creating the next edition of the Handbook of Labor Economics. My name is Tim Phillips. Economic nationalism and protectionism are becoming standard trade policy. Gordon Hanson of Harvard Kennedy School and David Dorn of the University of Zurich brought our attention to the transformative impact of globalization, both good and bad, a decade ago. So now I wanted to ask them what its long-term legacy has been and what the current trends in trade mean for prices, for growth, and of course, for jobs. Gordon, there is a perception that we're in an era of deglobalization, a retreat from that globalizing force that's been very dominant in the last quarter century. Is this correct?
It's partially correct. Globalization is not advancing at the crazy pace it did from the mid-90s until around 2010. And it's important to note that that was truly an exceptional period. The U.S. had led efforts to bring the world back to a situation in which countries were actively trading with each other after World War II. You then had about 3 or 4 decades of slow progress towards global economic integration, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, with developing countries opening their economies, and then with China bursting onto the scene. Things just moved into warp speed around 1990 and accelerated all the way up to the global financial crisis in 2010. Now things have slowed down, partly because you don't globalize forever. You get to a point where we're integrated and then things steady.
Yep.
But the policies are mattering. I do want to highlight the fact that those policies are moving us a little bit back from that intense period of globalization we achieved about 15 years ago. And it remains to be seen how much true economic decoupling there will be between the U.S. and China, between the U.S. and other countries, what Europe will do with regards to its global engagement. So we've gone from a period of hyper-globalization to a period of reticence about globalization, and lots of policy actions are still yet to be taken to determine what that future will look like.
A lot of the headline policies, though, really are overtly protectionist, aren't they? Things like the Inflation Reduction Act.
Absolutely. There is a concerted effort on the part of a number of global leaders to protect their economies from imports, and they have trumpeted all the benefits that this is going to bring. The impact on global trade has been to reduce inflows between pairs of countries, but so far that protection has been more bilateral in nature than multilateral in nature. Now, if Donald Trump were to be reelected in the United States, he's promising to put across-the-board tariffs on countries in the United States. That would be a significant action.
Yeah, he memorably tweeted that trade wars were good and easy to win, so you could guess that that's what he's going to do.
He promises a lot of things and delivers on some of them, so who knows?
Is it all about tariffs, or are there other impediments to globalization as well that are emerging?
Well, tariffs matter in particular for trade in physical goods. Trade in services is an expanding share of the way in which countries integrate with each other. And there are myriad barriers that get in the way of trade and services. Those are harder to measure, but they're important, and countries are not doing things to ease trade in services. And so that's going to be probably the most important front of future trade wars.
David, one of the reasons why globalization became unpopular in many cases was because people considered that it threatened their job. Now, you've done research into what economists call the China shock, which was that wave of globalization that drove the growth of China's economy. Did it have that effect on American jobs?
Yes, the China shock, which was the massive expansion of Chinese exports, not only to the United States, but also to many countries in Europe and elsewhere, that came as an enormous shock to Western countries, because within a very short period in the 1990s, and especially between 2000 and 2010, China just became very, very rapidly so competitive in many sectors, from textile production, shoe production, toys, furniture, consumer electronics, that as a consequence, industries in the West just could not compete. And so in the United States, but also, for instance, in the United Kingdom, many jobs jobs were lost in a short period because factories closed down in the face of Chinese competition. And in those regions that really heavily dependent on such industries, that left a big hole with a lot of people out of jobs and also with a lot of social dislocation as a consequence.
That is the reason why globalization got, in many cases, a bad reputation as a job destroyer. Overall, was it a job destroyer?
Well, that's a more difficult statement to make. Of course, it also depends on whether you take a national perspective or a worldwide perspective, because it's clear that for China, for instance, this probably was a relevant part in China's enormous increase as an economic power, which also meant actually at the worldwide level that, according to some estimates, worldwide income inequality declined just because so many people in China and other low-income countries experienced rising incomes. But the big thing is that even if many estimates still suggest that on average people also in Western countries benefited once you take together the positive effect of access to cheaper goods, the fact remains that the distribution in the population was very unequal. Those people who lost their jobs because of Chinese competition and who then failed to secure other stable and well-paid employment, or those people who live in cities that went on a spiral of decline because the important factories closed down, those people clearly had very negative experiences.
So looking forward, then, we have reached this situation where the uncoupling of these large economies seems inevitable in some cases. Do you believe that there are policies in place that will make this a less traumatic event now for the workers in those economies?
I would say not. There is this principle in economics known as targeting. You identify the problem, and effective policies are one that go right at the problem. So if the problem is joblessness, that was the result of globalization or a result of technological change, or that might result from the energy transition, we want to then think about how we create jobs where they've been destroyed, helping workers make that transition. Tariffs are questionable in their impact on jobs in general, but really violate that principle of targeting. We unfortunately haven't learned the lessons we should have regarding job loss created by the China trade shock or globalization more generally. And so now as we're looking ahead to the energy transition coming down the pike, we're not in good shape to deal with the adverse employment impacts of that looming change.
Let me read you a quote. It says, "The Inflation Reduction Act will create millions of good-paying jobs in clean energy manufacturing and infrastructure." That's Joe Biden selling the act. That sounds to be exactly the opposite of what you've just told me.
So there's a question about whether what the Biden administration is doing will expand employment and earnings, and whether it will do so in the places that have been hurt by globalization or other adverse changes in the economy. So when you subsidize a particular industry, that industry tends to expand and employment will grow and we might see some wage growth. That's going to be concentrated in areas that are well positioned to be part of the green economy. Those are in general not the places that have suffered job loss as a consequence of globalization.
So could you suggest to me, either of you, the sorts of industrial policy that we should be pursuing for job creation and for innovation at the moment? And we really do have some important innovation to do and not long to do it, don't we?
So I would highlight two sets of policies that we should enact, but they aren't industrial policies.
Okay.
One is triage. When you have concentrated job loss resulting from increased import competition, sudden technological change, or a shift in how we produce energy, you want to help workers transition to new jobs. Generous and extended unemployment insurance is very helpful in that regard, especially where that job loss is really spatially concentrated. Then you want to help workers retool so that they can take up new good jobs in some other part of the economy. And that requires the sorts of worker training and career and technical education that we're kind of slowly and fitfully figuring out how to do well. But there's actually pretty good news on that front. Now, those two elements, dealing with unemployment and worker training, are parts of the policy package that President Biden, say, has put on the table. But they're kind of, items 11 and 12 and not items 1 and 2.
I would certainly also emphasize that tariff policies are less likely to be helpful to workers. And there we also have actually evidence from our recent research on the tariffs that the Donald Trump government introduced against China, in particular in 2018 and 2019.
Buy American, hire American, buy and hire American.
Those policies were sold as having the goal of bringing back jobs to America. What we really see is very, very little evidence for that. If anything, there is a little bit of job loss in industries that then suffered from retaliatory tariffs that other countries levied on U.S. exports.
You know what reciprocal trade is? When they screw us, we screw them. It's very simple.
And the reason why there seems to be little employment gain is in part because the US reacted just to these tariffs on Chinese goods by importing more, for instance, from Vietnam or other low-wage Asian countries. You also see that the US industries that had their goods becoming tariff protected just increase their prices, right? They sell their goods at higher prices, but that does not create jobs. They seem to also reroute some of the goods that they would have exported to the domestic market, which again is not an expansion in production. And so it's just not that clear that by putting up profits, that this will immediately give you a feedback into creating more jobs in the protected industries.
And I suppose one of the problems about this as well is once a wave of this kind of tariff protectionism starts, it spreads. And we're seeing similar policies enacted in all major economies now.
Tit for tat trade protectionism is something the world has gone through in several different moments in time. Perhaps the most famous episode of this is what happened in the 1930s. We had mechanisms in place to help us avert one country's tariffs turning into a broader trade war through the World Trade Organization. Countries could bring cases against each other saying you're violating this commitment that you've made, and they would sort things out. The U.S. emasculated the World Trade Organization's ability to handle trade disputes. And so now we're in a war without a referee.
Let's hope that we manage to step back before we do anything very destructive for jobs. It's very interesting research that you've done, runs counter to the popular narrative, so let's also hope that the policymakers are listening. David, thank you.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure.
And Gordon.
Thank you very much. It's been great to be with you.
Thanks for listening. The Rockwell Foundation Berlin Institute for the Economy and the Future of Work is providing new knowledge to inform public debate and to create the best possible basis for policy making. Find out more at rfberlin.com.